In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about how SDT characterizes motivation and its quality, and then later we'll turn to talking more about how this impacts health behaviors. So first, we often think of motivation as something that's just we have more or less of, we're motivated or we're not, we try to become more motivated, but motivation is, at least in SDT terms, is not just about the amount, it's really about the quality of motivation. And so it distinguishes between two broad types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and I'll say more about what each of these is in a minute. And so it distinguishes at the very least between these two broad types, and says that just measuring undifferentiated motivation, as in just more or less of this single entity motivation, is an inferior way to predict important outcomes. Just knowing whether or not someone's motivated and how much tells us something, but it's not going to tell us as much as knowing about the quality of their motivation will. And so what we mean by quality is motivation that is more towards the intrinsic or fully intrinsic motivation. And so it's at its stereotypical, most clear example of intrinsic motivation would be child playing, right? We don't need to teach children how to play. We don't need to incentivize them to do it. They do it on their own and they enjoy it. They want to seek out new objects in the environment and explore them and play with them and see how they work. And so we would say that children are intrinsically motivated to play. It's something that comes directly from within the self. We don't need to incentivize it in any way. There's no need to use rewards or punishments to get the child to engage in this behavior. Sports are often intrinsically motivated, at least until we ruin them for many people with too much competition, but often we do these things because it's fun to engage in that activity. We get inherent joy in the activity itself, and that's what it truly means to be intrinsically motivated, is that the activity itself is the reward. The activity is engaged in for its own ends, because it is its own reward to engage in that activity. And so certainly sometimes we play sports to win trophies or to get accolades from other people, but in many cases people, especially when people are playing with their friends or intramurals, people are doing it because they truly enjoy that activity. Another example of this, again, before we ruin it for many children, is reading. That this is something that can be really intrinsically engaging. Maybe not all of the readings for this class, but I was talking to students about some of the things that they were doing over quarantine to entertain themselves, and reading for pleasure was a major one of those things, right? So this is something that can be intrinsically motivated. You do it for its own end, not just to get a grade in some class. Sometimes we read because it's enjoyable. A really great example of intrinsic motivation is video games. We'll see later, we're going to talk about how basic psychological need fulfillment facilitates intrinsic motivation, and we'll see that video games are really good at fulfilling basic psychological needs, and so they're very intrinsically motivating. They're fun to engage in for their own, they are a reward in and of themselves. Extrinsic motivation would be the opposite of this, and this is when we engage in behaviors to obtain some other type of outcome, whether that's money or a gold star or approval for someone else. So we think of this as the carrot and sticks approach, right? This comes from the metaphor for how horses are trained. We might reward them with a carrot or beat them with a stick as a punishment. And so this very much comes from a behavioral perspective, where the drivers of behavior come from external incentives, whether positive or negative, to engage or not to engage in a behavior, rather than coming from within the person, as it does with intrinsic motivation. So that's a simple way of looking at it, with these two very archetypical types, right? Of you're either doing it for external reasons or you're doing it because you enjoy it. But of course, life's more complicated than that, right? We certainly think of examples of each of those things, but often it's more complex than that. And so in its organismic integration theory, one of the sub-theories of SDT, it posits that there's really motivation falls along a continuum of quality. And so at at the ends of it are, well, first there's the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation like we talked about, right? So intrinsic being truly for fun and pleasure, and extrinsic being because others are incentivizing you or forcing you to engage in that activity. It's external factors are driving it. And so in the motivational continuum, we actually break down extrinsic motivation further. Then we also add just the category of amotivation, because certainly people are at times not motivated for things. And so breaking down extrinsic motivation further, we can think about external regulation, which is really what we've been talking about so far, right? You're doing it for external reasons. This is what's regulating your behavior, right? Your motivation is coming from external forces. Moving one step in from that is introjection, and this is when you're doing something because you feel like you should, or you would feel guilty if you didn't, right? So this is now you've taken those external pressures coming from other people or from the environment around you, and you've internalized those somewhat, and you're exerting those pressures on yourself, right? You might hear sort of voices in your head telling you what you should do, and so often these come from the pressures we've heard from parents or others in our lives or from society, and so now you've taken them in on yourself, and you feel like you should engage in this behavior. Identification is, again, getting closer towards this intrinsic type of motivation, and here the person really values the behavior, right? They do think that this is important. Maybe it's not fun, it's not purely intrinsic, but it's something that's important to them, and they do, it's concordant or congruent with their goals. Integration is very similar to that. In many studies, they don't distinguish between these two types, but integration is just even one step further, where not only do you value not only do you value engaging in this behavior, but it really fits with all of your other values and goals, and so it's integrated in that. And so an example of where you might be identified with something but not integrated is where I might be very identified with, I think it's important and I value exercising, but I find that it doesn't fit very well with all of my other goals. I spend a lot of time preparing for work or doing other things that are important to me, and then that gets crowded out, and so it's not well integrated. And so sometimes we distinguish between those two types. And then at this pole here, we have intrinsic motivation, or the purest form, where you're really doing it purely for the fun and pleasure of that activity. So this is kind of the things that I said, but with a motivation, right, this is when the activity or whatever the area that we're examining here is not really relevant to the person, maybe, or maybe they just don't have any intentionality, or it seems so difficult that they wouldn't be able to do that, right? So thinking with a health behavior, maybe it's with quitting smoking, maybe you're amotivated around that because you don't perceive it to be something that's really relevant to you, like, yeah, you smoke, but you're young, you got time to quit, maybe you just don't really care about that issue, you're not intending to quit, or maybe you just feel like that would be so difficult to do, your perceived competence in that is so low that you're not even going to engage in that. With external regulation, right here, it's the salience of extrinsic rewards and punishments are what's driving the behavior. So you're complying with those behaviors, or maybe you're reacting against them. Maybe there's external forces that are trying to push you around, and you're reacting against that. Maybe your parents want you to do something, and because they're forcing you to do that, you actually react oppositely. Again, with intrinsic, this is interest and enjoyment and inherent satisfaction. Introjection is also, we often think of this as like ego involvement, right? Your sense of self is really involved in this activity, but not really in a good way, right? You're focusing on getting approval from others and approval from yourself, right? This is where you would feel guilty if you didn't do it, right? And that's really a self-reflective emotion, and that's a self-conscious emotion, right? It's your feeling that you would feel bad or guilty about yourself. Identification, again, is the conscious valuing of that activity, and you endorse those goals. And integration is that this really, again, fits with all your other goals. It fits in a synthesis hierarchically. They fit well together, and so it's easier to pursue those types of goals. So all of these motivations along this continuum, we can map this right onto a continuum of perceived locus of causality, and you might have learned about this in other courses, but this is really just how much we perceive that we are the center of action, that we have control over outcomes. So where is what's driving causality? Is it me, or is it the external environment? And so these are all varying along that, right? With amotivation, there's an impersonal locus of causality. You're not involved in that. You're so disconnected from that it's impersonal. But then with these other ones, it ranges from an external to an internal locus of causality, right? With external regulation, your behavior is being driven by external forces, so you perceive that those are what's driving your behavior. Whereas with intrinsic, it's purely internal. You see yourself as the driver of those actions. You're engaging in that because you want to. And then these other ones in here range within that, right? From fully external to fully internal. So we could tie this back to the example that we used at the very beginning of this lecture, where you think about why you might want to change a behavior, right? And so we can see these different motivations on the continuum that are reflected here, right? So this first one would be a motivation. I don't have any reason I want to change, or I don't know why. 2 would be the introjection. Two would be external regulation, because you have to. Someone's making you, or circumstances necessitated in some way. 3 would be introjection, because I feel guilty if I didn't change this behavior. It's something that I really should do. 4 would be, this could map on to both. Internal is. Both identification and integration, right? So here we're not distinguishing with these two. This is, I fully agree with the value of changing this behavior. If we did want to distinguish between the two, the slight difference would be that that fully integrated would be this hierarchical synthesis of goals, that those goals would fit well together, that they wouldn't be interfering with one another, whereas there are times where we might value two goals, like, for example, maybe spending a lot of time with family and also being really good in our career, and those might interfere with each other at times. And so when they're fully integrated and don't interfere with one another, that's the difference here. Or it could be, again, intrinsically motivated because you truly enjoy it. You're really excited about making this behavioral change. And particularly within health psychology, we're mostly interested in these different forms of external regulation or extrinsic regulation, because most health behaviors aren't fun. Certainly there are people who enjoy exercising, but they're not the ones that we need to get to exercise. We're really usually trying to help people get to a place where their goals are integrated well within the self, so that it's easier to pursue those goals. And so this is a really key area that SDT investigates. And so what we've covered so far is what these different qualities of motivation are, and what we know from research is that the quality of motivation, so the further you are towards the right of that continuum, the more intrinsic or integrated your goals are within the self, then you're more likely to be successful at achieving health behavioral goals. So this could be not smoking, this could be exercising more, having a healthier diet, controlling your glycemic index if you're diabetic, adhering to medication, engaging in dental hygiene like flossing regularly. And so later in this lecture we're going to look at some evidence that supports this. But this is just to map one more example here on these different aspects of the motivational continuum. We can think about the example of exercise, right? And so what we've seen, we could think of this as, we could give an example of what exercise and the motivation for that would look like at each point along this continuum. So for a motivation, this would be I don't care at all about exercise. For external regulation, I only exercise, for example, when my gym teacher makes me. Introjection might be I feel guilty if I don't exercise because I worry about getting fat. Identification might be something like it's important to me to exercise because I want to be healthy. Integration would be exercising is an important part of my identity and it fits with my values and goals. And intrinsic motivation would be like, I love playing ultimate frisbee, right? You're just doing it because it's truly fun. And so again, I said that these can predict important outcomes. And so again, with this example of exercise, in one study they assessed what people's motivation for exercise was with a bunch of self-report items like this. They didn't have the ultimate frisbee one, I made that one up, but like this and like the example I had previously, and people assess what are their reasons for engaging in exercise, and then they looked at how much they actually were exercising. And what we find, this is the correlations here, is that external regulation and introjected regulation are not significantly related to actually exercising, right? So you can be very motivated by external forces or by guilt, but it doesn't actually lead you to exercise more. Whereas identified and intrinsic motivation, in this one they didn't look at integrated, they just looked at identified and intrinsic. These are both significantly related to more exercise. If we want to just group these into broader categories and look at and compare external and introjected as the controlled types, again, those don't have any significant impact on exercising, whereas these two more autonomous or more intrinsic types, these do have a significant effect. When I teach this live in person, someone usually asks, why is it that the identified is higher, is a stronger association than the intrinsic? And this is because sometimes things are not fun. Sometimes your body hurts and you don't want to exercise. And so if you're just doing it for fun, then you may be less likely to do it as often as someone who's maybe sometimes has fun, but is also doing it because they really deeply value it. And so particularly for these health behaviors, this is often the type of motivation that's most strongly related to sticking with that behavior, because it's not fun. It's really important to really value that and think it's important and fit it in with your other goals in order to be able to stick with that. So I'm going to stop there, and then I will pick up again in talking about basic psychological needs, because here is where we answer the other question that always comes up is, okay, great, like you want to have this more positive, higher quality type of motivation, but how do you move to the right of that continuum? Say you just are doing it because you would feel guilty if you didn't. So how do I get to become more intrinsically motivated, or how could I help somebody else become more intrinsically motivated? And so that's what we'll address next.